We have to make sure that the politicians are held accountable.
Every administration had the ability to put a ban on asbestos.
When it comes to asbestos, it really is about power, money, and politics.
And it is my pleasure to introduce Tom Laubenthal.
Thank you to Linda and ADAO for having me back again. I appreciate that. Since the last time I seen you 2 years ago, I had a brother that was diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis and has survived. He had both lungs transplant as well as liver in one operation and has survived, and it was at the Cleveland Clinic, and he's been alive for a year and a half. And as much as I haven't had a loved one die of an asbestos disease, I've learned your anguish in terms of how families have to survive deadly diseases like this and hope that they survive the procedures that they went through. So I could share a little bit of that with you. Actually, Dr. Flores had talked about prevention, and I want you to understand what I represent, as well as numerous people at the table here, is the modern asbestos control industry. We're really the front line of prevention today. We're doing battle every day to try to prevent exposures and disease. And what we're going to talk about today about what doesn't happen with communication is to try to separate a little bit of what is should versus required. And there's a big difference between those two. All right, so what we're going to break this down to three groups: workers, maintenance, those in trades and those doing asbestos removal, schools. Linda asked me to also address school issues, and there we have maintenance staff, contractors, and then also communication to family and caregivers. And then also the homeowners and the public in general, but really about homeowners, materials in homes, illegal, accidental, unintentional releases that could affect homeowners. All right, so communication to who? Is it required? Well, actually, not in all cases. We're going to go back to the shoulds versus the actual shalls versus should. This is quite regulation specific. Who is it required by? We're looking at two major agencies here, the EPA and OSHA, maybe both, in a lot of cases neither. And does communication happen well even though things are required? Well, sometimes. All right, so to the workers. Asbestos removal workers, the contractors performing renovation or demolition, the rules are fairly clear about the training that they're supposed to have, and there is a modicum of enforcement to ensure that that sort of thing occurs. And most of your removal contractors do have some level of training, as well as demolition renovation people that are involved in that kind of work. Where we don't see this happening, and why I have it indented, is your maintenance staff, trades such as plumbers, electricians, to general maintenance people where asbestos is present. They may or may not ever even hear the word or get trained. And your cleaning staff, the people that are actually cleaning in buildings, it could be something like asbestos debris from damaged materials, and something we may not always think about, but when people do floor stripping over asbestos floor tiles, there's really specific rules on that, actually. We had a university that made a mistake in Atlanta and bought a dry stripping machine, and they did an entire floor of a university lecture hall dry, and created a $35,000 dust cleanup, as well as God knows what exposures to people. So this still happens even when you have a university with an advanced program. All right, where does the training come from? With the Environmental Protection Agency, we have a thing called the Model Accreditation Plan, and that is part of a regulation we call AHERA, which is a schools rule, K through 12. Last time I was here, we kind of went through that in some detail, and it's about training to the maintenance staff and cleaning people and the like. OSHA, we have two major standards that I'll hit. Construction incorporates what we call the Model Accreditation Plan and the awareness training requirements, and there are numerous other requirements there for training. Then we also have general industry, where we talk about awareness. And actually, we looked at a video here with the brakes. That's general industry. And they've been very clear in that regulation since the mid-90s about what's supposed to happen there. And then state and local agencies, which is really where your authority is today, can require additional training, but it's also certification licensing, if you will. So where do we get failures? The biggest problem is negligent training providers, and there's story after story about training providers that just basically issue certificates with nobody actually sitting through classes, or you could pay a different charge and actually take the test while you take the class. It just goes on, to people that are actually absolutely unqualified to teach classes, and people don't get what they need. The problem is, and the other is that contractors that are doing removal also assume that the worker training that these guys take, a 4-day worker training program, is all they need to hear. Absolutely not the case. We have a thing called a hazard communication standard within OSHA and numerous other things that require much more in terms of actual training than what they take is just standard training courses. Then typically what we really have, actually got that broken down here. Okay, lack of OSHA EPA compliance across the board, and that's really the fault of employers. There could be everything from not knowing to just negligence, really. One of the things that really upsets me and many in our industry is that we have very poor field supervision of removal workers, and we have job sites out there where we're removing very dangerous materials like pipe insulation and fireproofing, and they're using the minimum level of protection. They're not erecting showers or taking showers. They're wearing street clothes under the minimum protective clothing. I could go on. Is very bad in some places. And then lack of enforcement. EPA and OSHA have really been cut to the bone in terms of what they can do. And frankly, OSHA folks, asbestos is not an emphasis program for OSHA. Matter of fact, most OSHA people in most offices don't know anything about asbestos, okay? And then really it goes back to state and local programs. Some are excellent, others are completely defunded or have no expertise, okay? So your removal workers there have poor supervision and just lack of enforcement. All right, so we'll kind of move over to schools here because we got to hit all this quickly here. Asbestos in schools, again, we call it a HERA. This is where we have asbestos inspections that are required and written what we call management plans, which I'm going to come back to. They have to do periodic real inspections and then maintain the condition of the material. And then when we do these inspections, there's a process called assessment. And when we find damaged materials, they're supposed to get into it in a timely fashion, whatever that means. But there are significant communication requirements with staff and parents, caregivers, at least annually. All right, so we got the Reinstein High School Management Plan over here. Okay, so you're a parent or guardian and you want to know about what's going on in the school. What I suggest you do is you call the administrative office, not the school, okay? The school often won't know how to answer your questions and ask to speak to your designated person. That's the person that's supposed to manage these issues on behalf of the school system. Okay, we call these school systems local education agencies, or LEAs, so I'm going to use that abbreviation. Ask to see the copy of the management plan. That's why I have this thing on the right. Don't ask for the inspection. The inspection is normally part of the management plan. You would hope that they would be able to explain these documents to you should you ask questions. You do have the right to ask. It's in the regulations, folks. And frankly, if there's no help there because we have poor compliance with the HERA, you might want to get a hold of your state or EPA people and try to get some help there. Folks, in Georgia, where we are, we have an 89% non-compliance rate with the HERA. That's not just us. The senator from Massachusetts wrote a report a couple years ago about his state, and I'll be honest with you, it's not just those states either. All right, so with schools, if you look at this web page, it doesn't show up great on the screen, but if you look at the bottom left corner, see where it says school buildings? There's a thing called Find Resources for Schools and Parents. It's an excellent place to start. And it's always best to get as much training here and learn as much as you can before you go to the school and start asking questions. That way you might know the right questions to actually ask. Okay, some failures there. Schools are not required to perform regular air sampling to determine asbestos in air. It's a very common question I get. Folks, there is no ambient air level standard for asbestos, but people seem to think this actually is a requirement in schools. It never has been. The only thing we're required to do is final clearance air samples after we do asbestos removal work. And that's, remember, should versus required. Is that something maybe we should do? Perhaps. But what standard would we use? We don't have one. EPA and state audits these local education agencies for HERA compliance, but with not enough regularity to assure compliance. Although I will say some schools do very well at this, but it's usually bigger school systems that are well funded. When we get out into rural areas, we just don't see compliance. The LEA leadership, the school leadership, is often undereducated, which leads to non-compliance. And for many reasons, staff turnover is probably one of our biggest things. We see it in our classroom. I can't tell you how many times we retrain people in area local education agencies over and over and over as turnover occurs. And they got to come in and rebuild the whole thing from scratch. It happens all the time. It could be ignorance of the rules, which is not uncommon. There's no funding for compliance, and frankly, just plain old negligence. All right, let's go over here to homeowners, make sure I can get all this in. I want to make clear, and I think most of you may know this, but Linda and I have had many conversations about this. EPA and OSHA asbestos communication requirements do not really apply to private residences. These rules apply to commerce. when we hire someone to do something and it's their workers, not the homeowners. That's really hard to explain to people, okay? And if you call EPA or state and local programs, there's often little help for homeowners. Some may take the time to do that. I can assure you most of the EPA offices don't have the expertise much anymore. If you want to stick at the state level, and even some of those programs don't have expertise to talk to homeowners either. You know what they do? They send them to me. I'm at a local training provider because they don't know what to tell them. All right, so I came up with 3 rules for homeowners, and hopefully maybe you'd agree, but before you disturb, get educated, and frankly, we have some friends here that have been through this. I want you to understand what they've been through, folks. This goes on all the time. I run a LinkedIn page called the Asbestos Professionals Network, and I just posted an article about a couple that literally took down soundproofing in their house and contaminated the entire house, but all the goods were there. So the carpet and the soft goods, everything has to get pitched. It's a long, without going through it all. But we hope that, and I give you the picture here that we have at ADAO with trying to give people normal things that we tend to find. They're not alone. There are other pages over the years that have been developed this way. Compared to 20 years ago, there's more information for people to find, but it's not really always for homeowners, unfortunately. Number 2, get an asbestos inspection performed by an experienced certified asbestos inspector, period. And then only remove asbestos using an experienced certified asbestos removal contractor. But if you've looked into that, you know that they don't give those services away. This is very expensive, which is why some people will then go back and do it themselves and end up in trouble. It happens. Trust me, these folks are not unique. This happens all the time. And again, I have at the bottom there, guys, many state and local programs have lists of certified professionals. And again, if you've got a local training provider, they may be able to help you as well. We give recommendations to people all the time. All right, so some of the things we have with this: disasters, fires, possible illegal demolition. Get what help you can, make the call. And I'm talking here more about, something that you might see as illegal, like houses being demolished and things like that. Maybe best to call the state and find out if they know anything about it, but their assistance may be limited. Now, when we get into things like fires and floods, you need to understand that gets into much bigger groups. EPA has a separate group we call CIRCLA, the Superfund people. They normally take possession of these projects and run them with what they call OSCs that are in charge of these projects. So you have an Agency for Toxic Substances Disease Registry, CDC, NIOSH. These other groups tend to get involved in these big ones. Actually, the big fires we just had out in California, we heard a presentation at the EIA meeting just recently of the woman that was a program manager there for cleaning that up. And what people tend to forget with that, even though asbestos and other toxins are a big issue, getting bodies out of the debris is number 1. And then after they figure all that out, then they go burn pile by burn pile by burn pile. And they did look for asbestos in all those cases. But it was laborious and has taken quite a bit of time to do. And that was all under EPA CIRCLA for that. Okay, so again, with homeowners, you're your best advocate. You got to get educated as best you can. We've got our 3 rules. Get educated, get a good inspection, get a good contractor. And again, when you think something looks illegal, it may not be. But if you got a question, call your state and local regulators. They should get involved because sometimes they may be doing something legal that you might not understand how they're doing it. And the other part is that all of our removal contractors, not all of them work with homeowners. Some of them don't want to do work in homes either. A lot of our consultants are the same way. So what you want to do is you want to find a contractor that has worked on homes and has history with that kind of work, and make sure that they have a good resume, they have proper insurance and things like that before you take them on. We've got an awful lot of people that are trying to get into the asbestos removal market right now. A lot of our restoration companies, fire and water type companies, and other people that have absolutely no experience. They call me every week. So be real careful and look for experience in this kind of work before you take them on. All right, one of the last things I want to show you here for information, since that was about, back in 1985, the EPA came up with a thing we call a Purple Book. And when I was a young man, this was everything we knew about asbestos in one book. Every part of this is just about out of date and has been for years. So what happened is the group that I work with, that Linda is also partnered up with, the Environmental Information Association, we were approached by EPA a number of years ago and said, what do you think, guys? You think we should rewrite this? We go, yeah, what do you think? Well, what happened is, without taking you through the whole thing, we rewrote it. And so what happens, this has been out since, for a couple of years now. I was the project manager for this document, and actually Tony's pictures are in there. And a number of other people are in there that you would recognize helped to write this, but we did a national peer review on this. And I've had 0 complaints from any reader that's bought it. So apparently we've done a pretty good job of editing it, and you can get a copy of this. There's probably never going to be anything quite like this written again. It just has a good comprehensive overview of the asbestos issue, so I would highly recommend you look into that. One last thing Linda asked me to talk about. United States Geological Survey just put out a press release where they came up with a new device. Well, it's not a new device, but a thing called an infrared diagnosis of the Libby vermiculite. And what they're doing is they have a technique where you're basically looking for a chemical analysis of the vermiculite, not actually looking for asbestos. And it's a $20,000 device, very expensive. And I think what you want to use it for is a screening tool. You know, we have a chemical method right now that the Libby Trust is using right now, the Zonalite Trust, and it's a barium method for vermiculite, and they're looking at the cation in a vermiculite, not actually asbestos. So the thing is, folks, when you see this stuff from the United States Geological Survey, it may be a good research tool, but it's not the answer. Yeah, we've got, Linda's reminded me, we have over 1 million homes with this vermiculite in it, and they really need to rely on qualified laboratory to determine whether we actually have asbestiform materials in the vermiculite. And again, there's only a handful of those labs that do well with that too. All right, folks, I think that's what I got. Thank you all so much.